Before we start with the next of the Seinfeld reviews, I do want to apologize, as back in my Big Salad review, I forgot to wrap up and talk about another sub-story. That I talked about how the episode began, but I completely forgot to address what happened with that the rest of the review, and I do apologize about that. But there was a story at the beginning of the episode where Elaine goes to the store to buy Mr. Pitt this pencil. And it was a very unique one that Mr. Pitt wanted, and Elaine gave the guy who worked there, who wanted to call Elaine when the pencil had arrived at the store, because we had to order it for her. The caller let her know that, but Elaine gave him Jerry's phone number because she obviously knew the guy had a thing for her and wanted to ask her out on a date, and she was trying to avoid that from happening. What happened was, in the end, though, was the guy did call when he ordered the pencil, where the pencil could be this many days away. Basically, he called for every step of the way, obviously hoping to get Elaine's attention. Instead, he got Jerry instead. But what happened was Elaine did find the pencil at another store, and she did not tell the guy. Well, the guy ended up pulling a close talker from back in the Raincoats episode, who was obsessed with the Seinfelds. He basically went to the place and begged for him to give it to him earlier. So we did that, but then, Elaine bought it from the other store and, forgot to tell the guy, and to make up for him, she took him out on a date, basically. So that's the story I left out of that episode. So now we can move on to our 89th video of this Seinfeld review series, The Pledge Drive. The Pledge Drive kind of made me think of my days as a kid when I used to watch PBS growing up, and of course they would have the Pledge Drive, and they would advertise all these little these little prizes and merchandise and stuff you could get. It was all usually based off of the show you just watched. I remember being like, oh, I want this, but of course, as my parents always taught us, you can't be spoiled with everything, which is a valuable lesson for sure. I learned. I will be honest, I think this episode could have even been called One or Two Things. The Pledge Drive, yes, was kind of like a storyline, but I feel like the things that stood out, that when I think of this episode, I think of two things. One, the high talker, not the guy who talks loud, but who talks like this and is a man. And the second thing, of course, is the Snickers bar. What's that Snickers bar? We'll have to get to that in a second. So the episode starts off with Jerry, who's getting ready to be part of be appearing on the like a guest on the PBS Pledge Drive. But he's also talking about how he thinks Elaine's friend Noreen was hitting on him at a bookstore. George, who was with him, doesn't think so. But Elaine is like Noreen's friend, and she's like, was she really? But she has a boyfriend. His name's Dan. But he's a little odd because he's a bit of a high talker. So Jerry thought she was hitting on him because she said something like, "Excuse me, where's the humor section?" Jerry, being a comedian, thinking that he took that as flirting, when meanwhile she had, I guess, Noreen had a brother or something like that who had wrote a book or something like that. I think she was trying to see if he could find a book or something like that. So Jerry completely mistook it. But anyways, before that was all figured out, Elaine tried calling Noreen from Jerry's phone. And Elaine thought she was talking to Noreen, but in reality, she was talking to the high-talking boyfriend, bald, Dan. So now Dan's freaking out because he thinks Noreen's having an affair, or Elaine's not an affair, but Elaine, he thinks Noreen is cheating on him with Jerry. Jerry, though, meanwhile, received a thank you card, apparently, from... And I definitely thought of my girlfriend when I saw this, because I know my girlfriend's not the biggest fan of cards. She thinks they're kind of pointless, but it shows that Jerry thinks cards are, for the most part, pointless as well, which, I get it. I'm not going to knock people for that, but, there's still, a nice, gesture that you thought of the person for sending the card. But I guess this lady sent Jerry a thank you card for accepting to be on PBS, to do this bid on PBS for the Pledge Drive. And she was stopped by Jerry's apartment. I don't know if they were supposed to be dating or whatnot, but they never really implied it. But she seemed very upset by Jerry throwing away the card. To make it up to her, he asked George if he can get one of the Yankee players to appear on the PBS show with him to make up for it as an apology, which he said he would see what he could do. Kramer, though, meanwhile, of course, after, he hearing a story about how Jerry upsetted Kristen, the lady from PBS, for throwing away the thank you card, Jerry goes to pull out a bunch of cards he kept from his grandmother for his birthday, showing that he doesn't completely throw away cards. Well, then Kramer goes through them, and he notices that they all have like $10 checks in them from his Nana, and he's like, Jerry, and like Jerry never saw any need to cash them in, but he's like, Jerry, you gotta cash them in. Like, the woman, put her thought into this and whatnot. He's like, fine, I'll cash them in. So, he goes to cash in the checks, but what he didn't know was his Nana was on a very tight income, and that account with Chemical Bank was closed, and basically she had overdrawn the account. So she gets the call from the Chemical Bank, basically saying her account was overdrawn, and basically that they wanted to try to just figure out, just sort out how to fix the issue. But I think she wanted just approval that she gave them those checks. But she says, I'll be right there tomorrow morning. As she's hanging up, though, the guy on the phone says, oh, we can do this over the phone, but Nana instead leaves and tries to find the bank in a very sketchy area. She eventually does find that, though, but she has to get in touch with Jerry afterwards to, let him know what's all going on. However, here's the problem. First, Uncle Leo shows up to take her to a doctor's appointment. She wasn't there. And then he calls Jerry and says, keep an eye out, your Nana's missing. She hasn't left the house in the apartment in 25 years. So then Kramer says the thing about how, you realize what you did, what happened with how the checks bounced and what, and realized that Nana probably went looking for a Chemical Bank that closed down, and she had to be redirected somewhere else when she went to see it. So that's Jerry's fault that Nana went missing. But then when Nana went to call, it was when Elaine, who still thought that Noreen was obsessed with... It was when Elaine thought that Dan was still freaking out about Noreen, hitting on Jerry when in reality she wasn't. Jerry's Nana calls Jerry's number. Elaine picks up, and Elaine thinks it's Dan and tells her off and tells her to drop dead. Until afterwards, Elaine realized what she did, and then Jerry realizes too. He's like, "Oh my gosh, you told my Nana to drop dead! How could you?" So, yeah, Nana went on a quest, basically trying to get in touch with Jerry in the episode. So then, of course, I think Elaine did talk to Noreen, which Noreen basically says that she was not hitting on and whatnot. But meanwhile, though, before we get to that, because I forgot before we got to that scene, Elaine was getting calls to Mr. Pitt's office. Obviously, with the back and forth with Noreen and Dan, and or how Dan's freaking out that she thinks that Noreen and Jerry are doing something. But Mr. Pitt, of course, wants to neb in, wants to know what's going on, which Elaine has no interest in telling him. But she can't help but notice that Mr. Pitt was eating a Snickers bar with a knife and fork. Which, of course, Elaine's told all of her friends throughout the episode. In the scene where George is in a meeting trying to talk to the Yankees about having, one of the players go on the PBS pledge drive, and they're not too interested until they see George pulling a Mr. Pitt. This started this thing where it's like, something happened like at the beginning of the episode, like eating a Snickers bar or referring to yourself in the third person. We'll get to that episode at the end of season 6, which is hilarious. So like something else where like a trend started that George started to drag out. When they saw the way George was eating his Snickers bar with the knife and fork, that's when they were like, you know what? We could maybe do this. They seem interested. So he got Danny Tartable, who recently appear in the Chaperone episode. However, though, they went to a coffee shop, and George thought the waitress was giving him the finger because the way she pointed at the check with the middle finger. And then, of course, when she came back and Jerry tried testing it by asking her to point on the menu, she pointed with the pointer finger. George made a comment. The same waitress scratched her face with her middle finger instead of her pointer finger. So George again is freaking out, thinking everybody's giving the finger. So on his way to the pledge drive, he's driving Danny Tartable to the pledge drive. There's a guy before the guy almost tried to cut off George, did seem like he was an aggressive driver. So George then thinks this guy gave him the finger. He follows him for like an hour, which in the midst of all this, Danny Tartable eats a donut that they had in the car. He starts eating it with a knife and fork. He eats the donut with a knife and fork. There was Mr. Morgan, one of George's bosses, that Noreen seen eating a cookie, like a piece of candy with a knife and fork. And when her and Elaine had that conversation at Monk's about how Jerry thought she was hitting on him, and how Dan was freaking out about it, how Dan's a high talker, she was eating a cookie with a knife and fork also. But anyways, of course, obviously with George following this guy who ended up just having his hand wrapped because it was injured, and this middle finger happened to be the only thing pointing up, basically, which was unintentional to George or whatnot. He ends up not getting Danny Tartable to the pledge drive. During the pledge drive, though, Jerry's Nana calls, and Kramer, who had been wanting to be one of the phone operators taking pledges or whatnot, answer the phone. Because before this, back in the dressing room, Uncle Leo had stopped by to give Jerry some money because he thought that because Jerry was cashing these checks, he thought that Jerry was short on money, which happened later on when Jerry's parents were up to visit. They basically thought that Jerry had no money, so they're trying to give him money, basically, but Jerry wouldn't take it. But then there's a knock on the door, and it sounded like there was a woman saying, "We need to talk," and then Kramer had assumed that it was Noreen, and steps out, and it's Dan, but Kramer thought that the guy was, the way Dan was talking, Kramer literally thought that Dan had it for Jerry, which, he's like, that's not the case at all whatsoever. But Noreen and Dan break up. We do see Noreen, though, in the next episode. Yes, we do, in the Chinese woman episode, which is the next episode. We do see her there, so her story doesn't end here, of course, but her and Dan, they do split up. But anyways, while Kramer was on the phone, Nana calls, and then Kramer again thinks it's Dan, but then finally Nana goes, "This is his Nana," and Kramer's like, "Oh, Nana, I'm sorry," and he talks her into maybe making a donation. And then during Jerry's speech, Kramer stands up and says, "Hey Jerry, your Nana's on the phone. She's doing okay, and she's making a donation of $1,500 to the PBS pledge drive." In which Uncle Leo just crashes the show and just like throws a fit, saying like, "She's on a fixed income. She can't do that. Stop the show!" And then of course, at Monk's in the last scene, Jerry and Elaine are sitting there talking about Lorraine and Dan and Uncle Leo and then of course how Kristen obviously was even more upset with Jerry, with Danny Tartable of course not showing up as well. But then they start looking around and they see more and more people at the restaurant continuing on the trend of eating stuff like a cookie or like a Snickers bar or like basically anything finger food, eating it with a knife and fork. And they just go nuts. Finally, Elaine's like, "What has gotten into you people?" And that's that. That's the pledge drive. It's a fine episode. I mean, I will remember this episode more so for the Snickers bar thing with cutting things with a knife and like finger food with a knife and fork, which I thought was pretty funny. And of course, Jerry's, Nana trying to, get a hold of him, but yet they keep mistaking Nana for the high talker because, either Elaine calls talk to Noreen, but she got Dan and thinking, and it was how much they sound alike. She thinks that Dan is Noreen, and, just the whole, snowball effect happens there. But definitely that Snickers bar story was pretty funny. That actually came from writers Max Pross and Tom Gamble. I think Tom Gamble mentioned how they went to college with somebody they knew who literally ate a Snickers bar with a knife and fork. And Ian Abercrombie, who played Mr. Pitt, who started the trend in the episode, he was basically told he had to take the Snickers bar out of the wrapper, and he had to actually eat it. He actually had to cut it while talking, but then he was like, I can't do all that at once. So Larry Dave recommended, cut a piece, cut a couple pieces, then take a bite, and after you swallow, cut another piece, which did help for sure. He said, though, he went through like 4 Snickers bars during that episode, and he had, at the time, he passed away about 10 years ago, but at the time of the interview, which was like 2004, I think it was, he had never had a Snickers bar since. But the day after that episode aired, Abercrombie was at a restaurant. He had lunch. He was reading a paper and waiting for a refill on his coffee, when all of a sudden the waiter comes out with a plate, and right on it is a Snickers bar. And apparently the whole restaurant was in on the joke. And him still, of course, being new to the series at the time, was just like, he couldn't believe, like, this just aired last night, but this is already a big deal. So that was pretty cool stuff there. But that's what I'm going to remember most again about this episode. It's a fine episode. I mean, it's not one of my favorite episodes. It's not a horrible episode, but it's not an episode I would, like I said, when I go back and binge watch, or I just scheme through and watch my favorite episodes, it probably wouldn't be an episode I would, watch the whole thing through, like, every time I go through by. But it's still a good episode. Do any of you guys know anybody who cuts like a finger food with a knife and fork? Like, I actually knew someone in high school who ate their pizza with a knife and fork. But I don't know if I ever saw something like a Snickers bar or a cookie. I don't know. Maybe it's just a messier food, who knows. But that's the Pledge Drive, guys. What were your guys' thoughts on the Pledge Drive episode? The next episode is The Chinese Woman, which will be the 90th episode of the series. And so after the next episode, we will be halfway through with these reviews. Going at a good pace with it so far, I would say. But what are your guys' thoughts again on the Pledge Drive? Leave your thoughts down in the comment section below. Be sure as always to slap a like on the video and subscribe for more content on my channel. Follow me on Twitter as well at DemandAirborne93. Till then, guys, I'm checking out. I'll see you all later. Have a great rest of your night. And peace out, everybody.